How has a small country like Israel made a dominance like this, but the whole Arab world has not been successful? That's a great question. We haven't really discussed Israel much until now, so let's talk about Israel. As always, take a look at the map. Okay. Okay, let's go westwards from India. Let's go to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean region, the Eastern Mediterranean. So this here is Israel, the nation of Israel. And as you can see, every single neighboring country is its enemy. They all want Israel to be gone. They want Israel to disappear from the map. They want to erase this nation from the map. This tiny little desert nation. It's not a desert nation, but yeah. So they all want Israel to be erased from the map, and still here it is. Israel is still there. And the question is how is a small country like Israel able to be so dominant, but the Arab world has not been so successful? So the reason Israel has succeeded and prospered and thrived is first of all because of help from the West. A small country like this, with so few resources, cannot survive on its own unless it gets external help. Now, Israel has a very powerful and influential and politically active, to some extent, Jewish diaspora across the world, especially in the Western world, especially in the United States. So the United States has been a very strong ally of the Israelis over the ever since Israel was recreated in the 1940s. So the Americans have propped up Israel to a great deal. The British have also helped Israel. Nowadays, there are political problems between Israel and the US. Obama was very antagonistic to Netanyahu and Israel in general. And the Democrats in recent times, been not favorably inclined towards Israel. But historically, the United States has supported Israel to a great deal in terms of financial support, or military support, transfer of certain sale of certain military items, etc. And the other thing is that Israel is an extremely resourceful country. So the Israelis have always had this siege mentality, and you can't blame them for it because they are surrounded on all sides by enemies. They have fought numerous wars, etc. So basically the entire adult population of Israel is basically they're professional soldiers. They all undergo proper military training. They all serve as soldiers, and they are all ready to serve in the armed forces at a moment's notice. And Israel has a very powerful security service, intelligence services, the so-called Mossad and the Shin Bet, etc., which enables Israel to project power essentially at a global scale to some extent. It can target forces that are antagonistic towards Israel anywhere in the world. So they have proven this. They have demonstrated this time and time again. Operation Entebbe and the abduction of Adolf Eichmann from Argentina in the 1960s or 70s, 60s most likely, etc. So they are able to project power globally, and they are technologically very advanced. They have ensured that their industries and technologies are very advanced. They have this startup culture. They have this entrepreneurial culture. They encourage all that a lot, and they have ensured that they develop the best technology. So these are the factors that have enabled Israel to stay independent, to ward off the enemies. And let me also mention the most important factor: Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel is it's an undeclared nuclear weapon state. It has had nuclear weapons for many decades. It has never officially declared this, but it's an open secret. So that is one of the major factors, that if Israel comes under mortal threat, if it is under threat of being overrun by the enemy, it will use nuclear weapons as a last resort. So these are the factors that have ensured that Israel not only stays independent, stays secure, but also thrives. So that is the reason why Israel is doing well. And why are the Arabs not doing well? Because, well, the first thing is that the entire Middle East, it's always under crisis, right? The Middle East crisis has been going on for decades. Well, it's the Western powers to some extent that have ensure that this region is always under crisis, so that they are able to project power there and interfere, and basically control the various actions of various governments by playing sides, etc. So that is one reason. And the Arab nations are essentially, basically, these are artificially created nations. The borders that you see today are artificially drawn borders. This was all once under the Ottoman Empire and then under the British Empire. And various countries were controlled by various Western powers. And when they left the region, they drew these arbitrary boundaries. So these boundaries will change over time, as boundaries naturally do. So things will eventually someday come to some sort of a balance or equilibrium. So that is the reason why all these Arabic countries and basically the entire Islamic world is always divided and in a state of turmoil. This is the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of their internal divides and all that. It's a very complicated story, but to a great extent, it's been fomented and kept going by the West to a great extent. And that is also the reason why Israel has been supported so much by the West, to keep this entire Middle East cauldron boiling.